like most contemporary history, it starts after World War II, when the geopolitical chessboard was essentially reshuffled, particularly in South Asia, where we had new states of India and Pakistan. And this came at a time that the shadow of the Cold War was being cast over the region. The United States and the USSR were enlisting countries to their respective sides. And we went to South Asia, and India saw the US and the USSR trying to enlist these countries, and it said, you know what? We just had a couple hundred years of colonial rule. We have a lot of problems on our hands. You guys are talking about nuclear war. How about we just sit this one out? How about you just leave us alone for a little bit and let us try to develop this country and consolidate this massive democracy? We're going to be a part of the non-aligned movement and sit this one out as best we can. Pakistan put its hand up and said, I'm in the Western camp, sign me up. Pakistan saw that there was an opportunity here to receive diplomatic support from the United States, money, arms, superpower backing, if it was willing to cooperate against the Soviet Union, which it was. And the United States and Pakistan formed a military partnership, and the country allowed us to use military bases. We were flying drones, surveillance into the Soviet Union, and there was a limited tactical partnership that I would argue benefited both countries. It seemed like a fair and reasonable deal for both of our countries. But there were, I would argue, two problems at the outset. The first is that there was a mismatch in expectations. From Pakistan's perspective, this wasn't just about support and arms and money. They believed that this also meant the United States would come and support us if we ever get into a conflict with India. And if they do get into a conflict with India, as they did in 1965 and in 1971, and America didn't come and help, even though we quite explicitly told them that wasn't part of the partnership, well, they were going to feel alienated, betrayed, and resentful toward the U.S. So resentful that after the 1971 conflict that split Pakistan up, they attempted to turn away from the West. They embraced more Islamist ideologies and identities. They embraced a nuclear weapons program and went down a more dangerous path. The second problem with this strategy was that it also alienated India to a great degree. So despite this partnership with Pakistan essentially being about the USSR, and we refused to join the conflicts, right? Restrictions on the weapons we're sending to Pakistan. We remain a major donor to India. We support India in the 1962 conflict with China. So we're trying to walk a fine line, but ultimately it doesn't matter because we're a superpower providing arms and weapons to Pakistan, which is India's arch nemesis. And the famous line that they still use today is, look, Pakistan isn't going to use those F-16s against terrorists. They're going to use them against us. So from our perspective, you are aiding and supporting our enemy. And you're doing so with diplomatic support in Kashmir. So essentially, we had a Cold War policy that got marginal tactical benefits from militarily partnering with Pakistan, but ultimately ended up alienating Pakistan anyway, and alienating its bigger neighbor, India. And it was because of this alienation, particularly after the 1971 conflict, particularly after we started pursuing diplomatic outreach to China, that India said, okay, America, these are your partners in the region, Pakistan and China. Our two arch nemeses are your friends in the region. I guess we have no other choice than to align with the Soviet Union. And that's what they did in 1971. They signed a defense pact with the Soviet Union. People want to know why non-aligned India seemed close to the Soviets during the Cold War. Why weren't they with the West? Why weren't they with the democracies? That's why. It's fairly simple to a rural Pennsylvanian. It seems very simple. Okay. So we had this policy early in the Cold War that essentially alienated both countries, including Pakistan, but the Soviets invade Afghanistan in the late 1970s, and suddenly we have a reason to cooperate again with Pakistan. We both have an interest in evicting the Soviets from Afghanistan. There are some popular myths about that conflict that I think are worth dispelling, because in the popular telling, particularly by my Pakistani friends, Evil America came into the region, created the Taliban, created Al-Qaeda, created Islamist ideologies and extremism to defeat the USSR, and then we left. And we left Pakistan to deal with the mess, and frankly, all of their problems over the past 50 years are a result of evil America bringing this destruction to the region. Most of the assumptions that that argument is based on are incorrect, okay? It was the Pakistani military that embraced Islamist ideologies and began spreading and supporting them before the Afghan war, after the Afghan war, for the last 50 years, okay? It was the United States giving money to the Pakistani government to give to whichever proxy militant groups they saw fit to fight in Afghanistan. So if it was channeled to extremist groups, it was because those were the Pakistani government's favored proxies in Afghanistan. We're talking about a relatively modest sum of money by today's standards, $1 to $2 billion a year. So this idea that this small sum of money 50 years ago is the source of all of the problems in the region is frankly not credible, and yet it remains a persistent narrative in Pakistan and beyond. So we're familiar with the Afghan conflict. Eventually we leave, again causing resentment in Pakistan because Afghanistan is thrown into civil war, Pakistan is facing problems, and in their mind, America left us again. They pursue their nuclear weapons program even further, and America levies sanctions on them for it. They engage in a nuclear proliferation ring to send nuclear technology to a rogues list of countries, Iran, North Korea, Iraq, and Libya. And they begin promoting terrorism in Kashmir. So we're estranged again in the 1990s. And Pakistan again feels what I wish Steve Cohen had never come up with this term, but what he called the condom syndrome. Used, abused, and discarded. Okay. Coming to contemporary times, 9/11 happens. Yet again, we go from being estranged to having another reason to pursue tactical cooperation with Pakistan. Yet another conflict in Afghanistan with major American interests at stake, and really only one partner country to pursue. Most of you are familiar with what happened in the Afghanistan war, all right? Pakistan allowed us to use their territory to supply our troops, to transit the country, to prosecute the war. Frankly, their territory was critical to launch counterterrorism operations from Pakistani soil. But at the same time, they played a double game, backing the Taliban, backing the Haqqani network, and backing our enemies. And I want to be very clear here. These were not nebulous, ill-defined links between the Pakistani government and the Taliban. This was the Pakistani military, intelligence services, and government providing medical care and safe haven to the Taliban leaders. Medical care and safe haven. This is the Pakistani establishment warning them before US drone strikes and operations against the militant groups. This is the Taliban Leadership Council operating openly in Pakistani cities. This is Osama bin Laden living comfortably a mile away from a Pakistani military academy, okay? This is Americans coming home in body bags because Pakistan was playing a double game. It was, in my opinion, a failure of our imagination that this persisted for so long. Why did it persist for so long? Because they never paid a cost for doing so. We can maintain our proxies in Afghanistan, and we can keep the Americans on our side at the same time. Not just keep them on our side, they'll give us $30 billion to back the groups, our proxies in Afghanistan that are shooting their soldiers, so why on earth would we stop? We can have our cake and eat it too. And ultimately, I believe there's a lot of blame to go around. There were a lot of failures in Afghanistan. You want to know the number one reason we left in an embarrassing way under President Biden? It's because of the safe haven that the Taliban enjoyed in Pakistan. There are two things that I will say we have to consider in this dark equation, which is that one, Pakistan has also suffered from terrorism, a great deal, in fact. And really, it's the Pakistani civilians who have died at the hands of terrorists by the tens of thousands. Now, the natural instinct is to say, well, you made the bed, now you got to sleep in it. you're the one who's been supporting terrorism for decades, so you share the blame for this. And that's, obviously, there's some truth to that. But there are 240 million people in Pakistan, right? More than in the UK, Germany, and France combined, or similar numbers. Not all these people deserve what has been thrust upon them by the Pakistani state, I would argue. Frankly, this is a country that needs better leaders and better leadership. And it's not going to be solved by the persistence of a victimhood narrative that all of our problems are not the fault of corrupt leaders, not the fault of a military that is playing behind the scenes as the puppeteer. They're the fault of someone else. It's India, which wants to invade Kashmir. No, India is over it, okay? It's America, which meddled 50 years ago. No, it's your own government and your own military that have been propagating Islamist, militarist ideologies. So I think there needs to be a reckoning in Pakistan because it's really headed in the wrong direction. Now that we have essentially had a fundamental split with this country, they find themselves further and further in China's arms. And so you've got a nexus now of radicalism, economic depression, a growing debt trap to China. It's not a rosy picture, it's not a rosy story, but I hope that we take some important lessons away from it. And at least one important and positive step is that we've begun to double down on our relationship with India, which I think is strategically wise for a variety of reasons. And the fact that we haven't been closer to India for a longer period of time was really a casualty of this strange Cold War balance of power politics.